Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline, and I'm here today with Dr. Arielle Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is a yoga teacher, but she's also a licensed clinical psychologist who's worked extensively in the areas of trauma treatment, trauma recovery. She's the founder of the Center for Resilience-Informed Therapy in Boulder, Colorado, where she has a private psychotherapy practice in addition to a lot of other work as a consultant teacher, yoga teacher, and on down the line. Just a little bit about her technique, and I'm sure, Arielle, you'll tell us more. Resilience-informed therapy is a strength-based trauma treatment model that includes techniques such as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which we commonly call EMDR. She does body-centric somatic work, mindfulness-based work, along with her traditional psychotherapy approach. And she's also authored 6 books on trauma and trauma recovery. So welcome, Arielle. You are certainly the right person to be talking today with me about trauma.
Thanks, Lynn. It's really a joy to be here.
So I just want to start with that topic of trauma because it's become a little bit ubiquitous. But I think when people hear things like PTSD, which is the kind of the after effect of trauma, what comes to mind is a war, someone who got injured in a war, or someone who had years of sexual abuse years ago. And I think trauma has many more faces than that, correct? And a lot more prevalence than we might expect. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, I want to start in with prevalence because it's so relevant to our world right now. So when we look at the research around prevalence, it shows that, and this was a very broad study, about 3,000, subject number in this study, shows that about 90% of US adults, it was a US-based study, will experience at least one traumatic event in the course of our lifetime. This study happened pre-pandemic. So, and it's relatively limited in its scope in terms of just looking at the US. When we look worldwide, I think that we really see that the majority of us will experience at least one traumatic event. Most of us will be exposed to multiple traumatic events. And so coming back to the first part of your question, what do we mean when we use the word trauma? I think from going to who I refer to as the grandmother of trauma treatment, Judith Herman, in her work, we really look at any event that overwhelms our coping capacities, that overwhelms our capacity to digest and integrate that experience into the overall sense of who we are as a person.
So lots of us could be walking around with unresolved trauma because we don't recognize that what happened to us is trauma. Is that a fair?
Right. I think that you can even imagine that, if you're a fish in this is the water you're swimming in, you have to accommodate to that reality. And so sometimes we will normalize things that are traumatic as we use the word stress, right? We all experience stress. And yet when we have an accumulated ongoing stress in which we start to feel like we're helpless in relationship to it, that we have no way out, we don't have any end in sight in relationship to that. And then on top of that, either a car accident happens, or there's a significant loss that we've faced, or in today's world, all of these climate impact events, right? We had fires in our local Boulder community that we could see from our house and burned 1,000 homes last December, right? And floods and hurricanes and so forth that we're seeing globally.
Yeah, that's such an important point that you bring up, is where you have crossed the line from I'm a little irritated I'm carrying this thing around with me and I should, because when you were talking before, what came to my mind is people saying, oh, get over it. It happened. It happened. It's in the past. Get over it. But we carry things, don't we?
Right.
And so I used to call this the shopping list, that it goes on the list. Like another thing happened and further proof, the shopping list of how everything is screwed up in my life. Oh, and that happened. And then my capacity for handling the least little thing, the least little slight, the least little, they didn't have my cheese at the dairy section. I'd go crazy in this. Is it like a continuum where you're just moving along on a path?
Yeah. I think that there's a few things that you named in there. One is that the kind of collective voice of dismissing, it's in the past. Why aren't you over this by now? And how we validate that if it's important to you, it's important. If it's impacting you, it's worthy of attention. It's worth carving out space to really attend to that impact. And I often think of the events that we experience in our lives, and those that overwhelm our coping capacity are often also overwhelming our kind of sensory experience of ourselves in the world, that in some way or another we feel bombarded by, and then we protect ourselves from that in some form or another. So we start to avoid going to places, we start to isolate in response to the world, or we start eating to avoid feeling, or we start drinking to avoid feeling, or scrolling social media endlessly to avoid staying present with our body and mind and sensory experience. So I often think that part of the antidote is creating more space to be able to digest all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And when you don't, so the phrase, for better or for worse, the phrase is the issues are in your tissues, but they are, aren't they? If I have decided not to process something and I've decided to do that thing,
Right.
it doesn't go away.
Exactly.
Right? It's just gonna hang out and wait.
Right.
Correct?
It waits in our psyche and it waits in our bodies, right? It waits in our shoulders. And you can use weight, W-A-I-T, but weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, right? We feel the weightiness in our shoulders and in our
we're
hips.
literally carrying it.
Exactly. Our low back, right? Like, so, and it shapes us in a way that where we're, this whole idea of the body bears the burden or the body keeps the score. And then, it can kind of roll out into physical pain symptoms, or it can roll out into emotional reactivity in some form or another, or emotional shutdown. So as we're learning to create space to attend to this, very often the first phase is, why would I open up that Pandora's box? Why would I even turn towards this? It'll overwhelm me again, or I don't have those coping resources to feel all of that. And I think that's why we need really wise containers. We need very safe places and people that help us navigate all that we start to build up in there.
Mm-hmm. I was reading about, this is a while ago, my information may not be current at this point, but I was reading about early childhood trauma. And there's the 10 question thing that I don't know anyone who flunks that test of, did you have early childhood trauma in this day and age? I mean, your parents got divorced is on there, I think. But there are lots of things that happened in the past, but what I was reading about early childhood trauma is that people who either don't recognize that they had that as a child, or they do and they're just trying to move on, have a higher incidence in their 50s of heart disease, of blood pressure issues, of cancer, even that the diabetes, that the health outcome for carrying trauma, it's a big cost. It's not, I'm just putting this in the side and nothing more is going to come of it.
Right. That's exactly right. And those adverse childhood experiences and that ACE score that you're speaking about, that initial research came out in the 1990s. And now it's been replicated so many additional times. Even just in the last few years during the pandemic, there was another resurgence of looking at that ACE health connection. And it is so significant. It's more significant than what we often think of as the main cause of heart disease, which we think of as diet or lifestyle choices, smoking, lack of exercise. Those ACEs are actually more correlated to those health conditions. And then, of course, the mental health conditions that correspond with that as well, in terms of depression and anxiety, even suicidal thinking.
It makes me think of viruses that, like the shingles virus. If you've ever had the chickenpox, the shingles virus hangs out in your house, this house,
Right.
and it waits till all the grown-ups it waits till a vulnerable point in your life.
That's right.
And then it attacks the most vulnerable part of your body.
Yes.
Is that kind of how the body holds trauma? Is it's like this virus that's waiting to come out in one way or another? How does the body? I know there's been a lot of research on this recently about how the body holds trauma.
Yeah, I would say that the one of the strongest impacts, and of course we can look at this from many different angles, but one of those very strong impacts is in the autonomic nervous system. Because the health of our autonomic nervous system is really meant to move pretty flexibly between our sympathetic state and parasympathetic state. Even our breath reflects that, right? Every inhale is a little bit of sympathetic activation, and every exhale, a little bit of parasympathetic. And so we're meant to move and come back into stillness. And our autonomic nervous system, which is also very regulated by the health of our vagus nerve, is helping the body and mind be in open channel communication. We think of this as this bidirectional communication highway. And so much of that communication is going from body to brain or body to mind. And the health of our autonomic nervous system ties into every other system in the body. Your endocrine system health, your digestive system health, right? How are we eliminating, how are we assimilating nutrients, our respiratory health, our cardiovascular health. And so if we have an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, which inevitably stress can lead to, ongoing chronic stress, and trauma can contribute to significantly, we can stay keyed up in sympathetic states for extended periods of time, or in some cases, we get shut down into this ongoing, lingering state of collapse, in which there's an imbalanced version of that parasympathetic nervous system that's not being mediated with sympathetic activation. It's very, just complex, but at the most basic level, imbalances in our autonomic nervous system impact every other system in the body, including the immune system. I think that there's connections as well. You spoke about the shingles virus, but if we look at COVID and even long haul COVID, there are connections there between ACE factors and early childhood trauma and a greater propensity or a greater likelihood of developing long haul symptoms.
Interesting. So really that's it. Amorphously, I'll take any chance I can get to attack any system I can find. I think to clarity, because most of the people who come to our free downloads are all over this stuff, but just for clarity, I'm going to say autonomic nervous system, sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic rest and restore.
Yeah.
That moment in the middle, I think you were kind of describing freeze, maybe, where you collapse and just kind of leave the room.
Right. And in the polyvagal theory, which is a lot of what informs me as both a yoga teacher and a trauma therapist, that there's an understanding that the parasympathetic nervous system has two presentations, that in times of safety, it facilitates rest and restore, as you said, our rest and digest response. But when we've experienced ongoing trauma from which there's no exit, And when we feel helpless, that nothing we do is going to make a difference, it actually can lead to an evolutionarily older expression of the parasympathetic nervous system. I make a distinction between a freeze state and what we can look at as more of a faint state in the body.
A
And
faint?
it doesn't faint, yes. A faint state. It doesn't mean literal fainting, right? Although it could be a full vasovagal syncope, right? Which is a literal fainting, but often it's expressed more like brain fog, dizziness, chronic fatigue or ongoing fatigue states. And so those kinds of expressions have more of a parasympathetic dominance, but it's not,
but not in a good way.
Not in the good way.
Not in a good way. But it sounds like a protective mechanism nonetheless.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like protecting you from getting the shot at the doctors that you need.
Right. It's an intent of the nervous system to protect you.
From something it shouldn't be protecting you from.
Right.
But that you are averse to looking at. And the yogis are all about aversion. I wanted to touch on, because you did mention the vagal, the polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is called the wandering nerve. Is that the connection between trauma and all of those centers that you just mentioned?
Exactly. And it kind of even goes beyond that. But if we think of the vagus nerve as the wandering nerve, right, it travels down into our gut, it travels all along the spine, through our diaphragm, right along the side of the esophagus, so through that esophageal hiatus, travels into our lungs and our heart, into our larynx and pharynx in the throat, our inner ear, and around our face. So it's very widely extensive. But also, the vagus nerve works so closely with other systems in the body that it's receiving feedback from the endocrine system that will send back up to the brain, and it allows the brain to help regulate our endocrine system, receives feedback from our heart and the baroreceptors in the heart, or our blood pressure receptors, basically, receives feedback from how we're breathing, and so on and so forth. And so there's this, tremendous exchange of information that happens when we're really keying into kind of optimal vagal tone, which allows that communication to occur. And then sometimes we get breakdowns in that communication system.
What's interesting about that, and tell me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is, because of the widespread network of the nerve function, your trauma could have happened anywhere, and then could show up anywhere else. It could show up as something that you would think completely unrelated, that you wouldn't connect to the traumatic experience. So what are the implications of working with unresolved trauma? How do we sort of get to the point where we go, this is the problem, this is what we should be doing?
Right. Well, I think there's a kind of a few layers of that question. The implications in terms of like what we might be noticing might be that there are those physical symptoms that we've been mentioning, maybe, chronic pain patterns or chronic illness patterns. But I would always say that it doesn't mean you had trauma if you have those patterns, but it's an opportunity to be curious. And I think that it's really wise to know the territory from which we've come from and the territory that we're standing in now, as how those events have shaped us. So as a trauma therapist, as an EMDR therapist and a somatic therapist focused on healing trauma, we look at our past, we look at one's life, right? And we start to look, as you said, at those ACEs. And did I experience, events of neglect? Did I experience times of abuse? But even beyond the ACEs, right? If we broaden out, were there times in which I felt chronically misunderstood? Were there kind of experiences in which I felt relational betrayal? Have I carried excessive amounts of shame in my system where I just feel like I don't belong anywhere? Do I judge myself excessively? Do I have a very harsh inner critic that is just kind of beating me up from the inside out? And all of those types of experiences, emotional experiences, physical type experiences, mental experiences, we can even think of our five koshas in a sense as indicators of where trauma might show up, that when we are kind of looking across these different domains of self, and we start to see stuck points or patterns that aren't resolving, then we want to be curious, where does that highly critical voice come from? Where does that
Mhm.
chronic shame state originate from? Where did I learn this? When did I first remember feeling just that way? So we
Mhm.
use our current symptoms of ways to try and unpack how the past has shaped us. And of
Mhm.
course, our current circumstances of, do I feel safe in my world now? Do I have people with whom I feel understood and who care about me now? Or am I isolated? Am I cut off from my community? Do I not feel protected by my country? Right? These really significant here now events. Am I financially under duress on a day-to-day basis? So sometimes the traumas are the past, and sometimes there are these kind of peri-traumatic ongoing life events that we're trying to find our way through.
And it needs to be sort of safe to come back out, to come kind of out from hiding if you have been. Now, the yogis, the ancient yogis, seem to have a pretty good handle on this, because some of what you were describing seemed like svadhyaya, self-study. Some of the avidya, misperception of what's going on.
Mhm.
It does seem like there are a lot of connections between uh, where you are describing issues and where yoga could be very helpful.
Exactly. It is why it is such an integral part of my approach to working with trauma. I've been teaching trauma-informed yoga classes since 2008, so for quite a while, and integrating that svadhyaya, that self-study, as you say, and really looking at how yoga shows up, or how trauma shows up in all of those different self states, and being curious about it. And then learning practices like nonviolence, right? Learning how to be kinder towards ourselves, and noticing if we accept that self-compassion, or if there's voices that block that. I don't deserve it. Who do you think you are to talk to yourself so lovingly, right? And so then we can, again, kind of get to know what shaped us, what shaped those inner voices. And yoga is so profoundly helpful in this journey.
Is it also, because you talked so much about nervous system regulation, can you talk about how you might employ yoga as a vehicle for nervous system regulation? Not everybody can sit and have a nice conversation and go, oh, that's the deal. Okay, everything's fine now. Um, Thank you for explaining what happened, because I am carrying all kinds of things that I might not recognize. How can my yoga practice help me with that?
Yeah. When we talk about trauma treatment in general, we often say that it needs to be a balance between these top-down strategies and these bottom-up strategies. And what that means, it's actually, they're terms that are referring to the brain. So our top-down strategies are using our upper brain centers to basically create more regulation of the body and of the nervous system and of our emotions. So talking about something, reflecting on something, journaling, intention setting, working with negative beliefs and transforming them. Those are some really beautiful top-down strategies. But if they're not coupled with or partnered with bottom-up strategies, they only take us so far, right? Talk therapy only takes us so far. Bottom-up strategies are actually working with the lower brain centers and really working with the body to access more of the sensory experience, to work with movement and breath and changing from the bottom up. And so nervous system regulation through yoga is a beautiful bottom-up intervention that actually allows us to create a felt sense of change. from
Mhm.
which we're actually able to unhook some of those stuck mentalizations, those stuck beliefs, because the body is really not going to release the impact of traumatic events until we feel safe enough now. So we can cultivate a greater sense of balance or equanimity or safety by changing how we breathe, by allowing ourselves to find a little bit more movement in the body, even simple spinal movements, right? And, kind of awakening up that kind of stretch response and waking up through the lungs and creating more capacity to be with a broader range of what's here, what's held in the body. And then to also come back to that kind of calm, easeful state. And from there, those bottom up changes can start to almost kind of like set a whole new foundation. We've got a kind of fertile ground now from which new seeds of thoughts and beliefs and curiosities can arise.
It sounds like a safe uh, way to begin making a transition that might otherwise be too scary. It sounds like from a distance, you are approaching and you're coming in, you go, okay, well, this could be okay. Oh, well, this could be all right.
Yeah. Can I
It just
share with
sounds,
you a
yeah.
story?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So this is a story from quite a while ago. For me, this happened around the age of 21. Okay. And I was in college. I had this beautiful opportunity to attend a body mind centering workshop. And the work of Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who I know you're familiar with as well. And so some of her kind of more advanced students came to my college and were leading us in a workshop. And in this workshop, it wasn't a yoga class per se, but it had a lot of parallels. We were, kind of doing movements and moving the spine and doing some kind of rocking movements on the floor and so on and so forth. And that workshop, when I left it, it opened something in me. Now, on the one hand, I felt a lot of grief come out. I felt some real tenderness. It opened up a real curiosity about more body-centered healing that I needed to do. So it wasn't a one-time quick fix. But it also opened me to being able to look at my current life and life choices and recognize that actually I was involved and engaged in a relationship at the time and certain life choices that actually weren't serving me, weren't in alignment with who I needed to be. And I opened up a little bit of a feeling of what I actually longed for, what actually I did want in my life to be about. And that, I don't think I would have touched that talking through it, right? I had to have a new felt sense in my body of what it felt like to be completely held in an experience of vulnerability and to know that the floor wasn't going to drop out from underneath me.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. So you're going to be teaching a course for us soon, which I'm happy about because this is a really juicy topic. And it sounds like you have lots more to say about it. So you're going to be teaching a course on the topic of therapeutic yoga for trauma recovery now, and uses some principles of polyvagal theory. So the first question I have on behalf of anyone who's watching who doesn't know polyvagal theory, do I need a degree in psychology to understand this course? Or who will be able to use this course?
Yeah, I really try and make my information about this as accessible as possible. The book that I wrote on this topic, Therapeutic Yoga for Trauma Recovery, and applying the polyvagal theory for self-discovery and meaningful change and all of that, is we're really it's written for the layperson. It's written for the student. Now, that said, it can be profound information for the yoga teacher. It can be profound
Mhm.
information for a yoga therapist. So I try and, kind of hold a pretty broad range in terms of who would benefit from the material and how I teach the material. So no, you don't have to have a degree of any kind in order to benefit
But
from this.
we'll learn about how trauma affects our body and how yoga can help us mitigate
Exactly.
those effects. And there is a practice, correct? That you
Yeah.
do a practice. So you actually are going to show us how to put the theories into a sequence.
Yes. Yes.
It sounds super exciting. This has been so informative. Thank you so much for your time and for your work, really, because wow, what important stuff you're doing.
No.
And thank you for bringing this kind of awareness into the yoga community, where I am sure people can really, really use it. So we'll see you in your course very soon. Everyone else, we'll see you here in this space. Come back soon. Until then, bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.